You are tuned in to the Weekend Review, presented by the Prosper Group, where the right turns to win online.
Join us each week as we take a look at what is happening in digital advocacy and politics with a right-of-center focus. Welcome to the big 25th episode of the Prosper Group Week in Review podcast. I'm Dan Huber with Caroline Alexander.
On today's show, we'll be having that second part of a conversation with Amie Eichman. She's PG's fundraising specialist. So here's a quick snippet of that conversation.
I think the biggest thing that's important is investing now, because if you don't invest now, you'll regret it later.
We'll be talking fundraising with PG's expert, Amie Eichman, and then afterwards, Dan is going to share some social listening insights from the AM Rundown. But first, we're going to start with today's digital action item. So last week, we had discussed engaging and contacting those online influencers, as it's a super important role for your social media campaigns, and I hope you all pursued that. This week, we want to discuss your website content. Now's the time in an off year to go in, do some housekeeping, review what you have, and see if it's still up to date. Some questions you can ask yourself is this content relevant? Has it aged well? Is this still focused on the previous cycle? Does this match what people are concerned about? Anything should be changed? Now's your time to do this. If it's outdated, take the time, write some notes down. Anything that's necessary to update or rearrange, make it a good habit in the off year to get that started, especially if you're an incumbent. We want you all to be doing that.
Thanks, Caroline. That's a great action item. It's particularly important when we think about how much has changed in just the last year with COVID and everything. We're going to move on to a topic that we've been discussing a lot recently, and is quite frankly a favorite topic of the show and the Prosper Group in general. That's small dollar fundraising. Last week, I caught up with Amie Eichman, the fundraising specialist here at the Prosper Group. This week, we're bringing you the second part of that conversation. But before we get started, we just posted a new blog post on the PG website. It's OffYear Fundraising, Taking Away the Democrats' Edge. Amie helped out with this significantly and included 6 tips for off-year fundraising online. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. And in the meantime, here is part 2 of my interview with Amie Eichman.
So we're in the middle of the off-year election cycle. What should campaigns be doing for their small dollar fundraising right now? Is there any difference in that between incumbents versus non-incumbents?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that's important is investing now, because if you don't invest now, you'll regret it later. Right now, the focus should be building your house files, building your lists, convincing people who you are and where you stand, so they're very familiar with you, and then they over time become much more invested in your campaign. Because if you don't put in the groundwork now, you're not going to have a strong foundation to build off of next year, when it's really important that you're raising a lot of money. So during the election year, there's always going to be spikes in news stories or polls that you can piggyback fundraising off of, but you shouldn't be relying on those unexpected things for the core of your small dollar fundraising. And you can't do that if you don't invest now on building that foundation, those house files. So that would be like the biggest thing, is investment early, and focusing on building that strong foundation. The biggest difference probably between incumbents and non-incumbents are time. If you're an incumbent, you're running for re-election, you can start right away. So start right away. If it's a non-incumbent, usually, they'll launch their campaign a little bit later. They have to do a whole launch. They have to do all those types of things. So they have less ground. They have less time to work off of from. If you are an incumbent, you pretty much know the day after you win re-election, I'm going to probably run again, so I should start now. Non-incumbents generally just have a little less time.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. And how big of a role should testing be in this campaign fundraising, small dollar fundraising?
Well, the best thing about starting early is you have time to test things. So you have time to test messaging with audiences, whether it's going to get traction or not, because it really is unfortunate when you're, 4 to 6 months out from the election and you don't know what raises money on your house file. So the time to do that is in the off year. So you can test, well, is this more of an engagement topic where a lot of people get really fired up about it, but maybe they don't donate? Or, you send out a donation email and it does really well. So you're like, hey, that messaging has a lot of traction when it comes to raising money. So we should focus on that when it comes to the donation asks. And when it comes to the more like fiery topics that people don't really chip in off of, still, use that content, but maybe don't use it for fundraising content. So that's testing is a big thing. It also, the more, the higher budget you have, the more time you have, the more you can test.
As we talk about testing, I think it's natural to talk a little bit about optimization. For listeners that are looking to improve their fundraising, is there a couple ways that you can share to improve fundraising? Perhaps one thing they may not be doing that they should be doing, and maybe something they should avoid doing at all costs?
Yeah, so I think the one thing that people should be doing, but not enough people do, is, especially when it comes to emails, segmentation. When you're sending out an email, the best way to build up a rapport with a supporter is to make them feel special. And you do that by personalizing asks, and you do that through segmentation. So segmenting sends to non-donors or people that live in certain areas or people that have responded to other pieces of content in certain ways. Because you're personalizing those asks, the conversion rate to donors will be a lot better. So that's something that we don't see enough of compared to like just getting one email prepared and sending it to the whole list. So that's something that everyone can be doing that has an email list, that they should be doing. The one thing that I generally say to avoid is to avoid hitting on only national issues. While they're great and in the news, they're not as relevant to some people all the time, especially when it comes to like maybe there's some things going on in the state that affect people more directly. So definitely don't just focus on what's in the news cycle, like on Fox News. Try to boil it down to your location or what makes the candidate different. Maybe there's a specific topic that they really care about, because that's going to get better traction, because you're not just sending out the same content that every other person is sending out. You're again personalizing that ask to what the audience cares about, and that isn't always just the hot button national issue in the news that day. We'll still do that, but just don't do it for every single piece of content.
So localize a little bit is probably a good rule of thumb there, I'm guessing.
Yep.
Without necessarily naming a candidate or a race, can you tell us about your most memorable digital project or campaign and why it stands out?
Yeah, I've worked on a lot of races at this point, but the one that really stands out for me was one I worked on years ago. It was a statewide governor's race, and the problem that they had was that they were a big underdog and had very little cash on hand. So all the money that we spent for fundraising, like we had to make back multiple times because we were literally help fueling their campaign. So in those cases, it's always great to have a big campaign with a lot of money that you can spend and maybe break even and call it a success. But it's definitely more pressure and a little bit more rewarding when you have to stretch that dollar out a lot more. And it was kind of slow to start, but after a while we just hit the right message, and like you could feel it right away by using all the different channels that we could, and by heavy segmentation, especially of emails. We ended up raising, I think it was like $17 for every dollar spent that online. And we did that because we found that right message, and then we just kind of sent out very segmented content to people to personalize that ask. And then people, it was funny, people thought they were getting emails from the candidate personally, or I had the campaign manager's mother respond to an email thinking it was actually from him. So it's just that personalization that really worked. And it doesn't mean that you necessarily need to have the biggest budget around, but that probably is the biggest project that stands out in my experience.
Yeah, I think 17 to 1, 1600% ROI is pretty good for just about any campaign. So I don't think anybody would complain about that, but let's try not to set everyone's expectations that high.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your fundraising expertise with our listeners on the Week in Review podcast.
Well, a big thank you to Amie Eichman for coming on the podcast. She's been such a great guest, and she's so sharp, so smart about fundraising in particular. I know that whenever I talk to her, I learn something new. I would encourage you to check out the OffYear Fundraising, Taking Away the Democrats' Edge blog post that went up this week with the 6 tips for online fundraising during an off year by Amie. We'll include a link to that blog post in the notes for the podcast. Shifting things around today, next up we're going to do the AM Rundown, which is powered by social listening from the Prosper Group. It's sent out weekday mornings for political and campaign professionals to stay up to date with social trends online. And included in every AM Rundown, we have a digital best practice. So if you don't receive that already, I encourage you to check it out. This week, we've been continuing to follow the conversation around filibuster. It's a favorite conversation, particularly online and social conversations for the left. That conversation has dropped 17% this week to 138,000 tweets. So still going strong, but down a little bit this week. We continue to watch gas prices as the conversation particularly goes through the summer. The price of gas went down slightly this week, 1.7 cents on average across the country. And the conversation is also down 29% to about 28.7 thousand tweets. So falling off there, probably a little less pinch in the sense that there's just not as much demand perhaps as there has been, which would be indicative of the price falling slightly. The border crisis, this conversation continues to grow. For the second week in a row, the conversation around the border crisis is up 34%. The week over week total is about 49,500 tweets, so that's pretty substantive. And we've been watching the conversation around unvaccinated. That's up 35% this week, week over week, with about 232,000 tweets. There's a lot going on there, and we're also starting to pay attention to the conversation and the topic of masking, and that's up 29% to 152,000. So a lot going on there, and that's our social listening update for the week. Thanks, Caroline.
And make sure you all take some time to receive the AM Rundown, and you can sign up for that at prospergroupcorp.com/AM Rundown. That's prospergroupcorp.com/AM Rundown. And I wanted to give a quick thank you again to Amie Eichman for taking time and sitting down and talking with us and giving us some words of wisdom on fundraising. And of course, we want to thank you all for listening to the podcast. It's always a pleasure.
And one more thing before we go today, I want to send a big thank you to Caroline. This is our 25th episode of the Week in Review. And unfortunately, it's our last episode together. Caroline's still going to be around. She's providing incredible service to our PG clients. We're going to miss her on the podcast, but she's doing amazing things and really been excited to have her on the show and to.
Thanks, Dan. It has been a blast.
We'll miss you. Thank you.
You can find our Prosper Group Week in Review podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts.
If you like the show, please subscribe and share.